Welcome to the first video on Ancient Mesopotamia. Ancient Mesopotamia is a place where human civilization first formed. The people that settled in this region created some of the world's first cities. They also learned to read and write and even created some of the first taxes. Most of the writing is preserved on these clay tablets. The inhabitants also created large governments and economic systems. Trade routes were established using the sea and rivers. Trade routes were important because Mesopotamia lacked metals and timber, so these types of goods needed to be imported. Ancient Mesopotamia is often referred to as the Cradle of Civilization. You can see this area marked in red, and this constitutes the main portion of Mesopotamia. It constitutes an area roughly in modern-day Iraq, Syria, and a small portion of Kuwait. When we talk about ancient Mesopotamia, we can't avoid talking about the two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. In fact, the term Mesopotamia is Greek in origin, and it literally translates to the land between rivers. Everything revolved around these two titanic rivers. The rivers provided material, wealth, and nourishment to the great civilizations that ruled over Mesopotamia during the different eras. We will talk more about these two great rivers in the next lecture. Unlike Egypt, which became a unified entity under the pharaohs, Mesopotamia was a collection of several different cultures and political entities, which we will cover throughout the series. And this is why, in many respects, Mesopotamia is far more complicated than ancient Egypt. Although there was some sense of unity through shared gods, the spoken language and customs varied through the different cultures and ethnic groups. For instance, the Sumerians spoke a different language than the Semitic peoples, and we will discuss that later in the series. Despite these differences, many of these cultures had huge influences on each other. Also, at different times, different empires rose and fell. Okay, so let's look at the major periods throughout the history of Mesopotamia. And as always, I will break down each one of these eras later on in future videos. The first major era is often classified as the Prehistory Period. And this is before written history, so this is the least understood epoch. It moves all the way back to 12,000 BC, right at the end of the last ice age. So we are talking about a huge amount of time here, as this period lasted nearly 10,000 years. Imagine that. A major subset in this period is often called the Pre-Pottery Period. And that's because there is no evidence of the use of pottery in the archaeological record. There have been some granaries discovered, but there is also evidence of hunter-gathering. In some cases, there might have been some groups that were doing a sort of hybrid, that is, storing and planting of food while also participating in hunter-gathering expeditions. Now, around 6000 BC, we start to see some of the first cultures in the archaeological record. There is evidence of dry land farming. This type of farming was based on exploiting natural rainfall without the help of irrigation canals. Also, we see some distinctive pottery during these periods. Two major periods in Mesopotamian prehistory are the Ubaid and Uruk periods. In the Ubaid period, we start to see some fairly large village settlements. The homes were almost always constructed of mud brick and would have contained several rooms. Each one of the villages had a temple, which was always the largest structure. So it's clear early on that the temple was the center of their existence. In fact, the temples were always constructed on higher ground than the mud brick homes. There is also evidence of agriculture as well as domestication of animals, or simply put, herding. The primary animals were sheep and goats. These provided wool and created a vibrant textile industry in Mesopotamia. The Uruk period eventually replaced the Ubaid period around 4400 BC. During this period, Sumerian civilization began to take form. We also see the first urban cities. The city of Uruk, for which the time period is named after, played a leading role in the early urbanization efforts. Uruk may have had a population as high as 90,000 residents, making it at that time the largest city in the world. By 2900 BC, we see the early Bronze Age, and a period that is referred to as the early dynastic period. During this period, we see the first syllabic writing system. This period is marked by several Sumerian cities in competition with each other, similar to the early Greek city-states. Around 2350 BC, we see the rise of the Akkadian Empire. This was a big deal because for the first time, Mesopotamia was unified under a single entity, the Akkadians. This also united all the Semitic-speaking Akkadians and the Sumerian speakers. The Akkadian Empire controlled a huge amount of territory in Mesopotamia. A key figure during this era was Sargon of Akkad, who was the founder of the Akkadian Empire. Eventually, two major Akkadian-speaking nations would arise. First, Assyria in the north, and then a few centuries later, Babylon in the south. As I mentioned, the Babylonians were another Akkadian Semitic-speaking state. Babylon was greatly expanded during the reign of Hammurabi in the first half of the 18th century BC, and it became a major capital. It wasn't long after Hammurabi's death, though, that Babylon's political influence began to wane, but it still remained a very important cultural center in Mesopotamia. During the late Bronze Age, we see the rise of the Assyrian kings. During this period, they pretty much left Babylon alone. Mainly, this was out of respect for Babylon. Eventually, the Assyrian kingdom in the north began to fall apart along with many other civilizations. This occurred near the end of the Bronze Age. The exact causes for the Bronze Age collapse are not well understood. Nonetheless, out of the ashes, a new age arose, and that is the Iron Age. During the Iron Age, we see an economic upturn in the fortunes of Assyria, and this is referred to as the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Neo meaning a new or revived form of. So a revived and renewed Assyria became so powerful, it even eclipsed Egypt. The Assyrians during this period greatly expanded west into Asia Minor and then into Palestine and even Egypt. Eventually, several states revolted against Assyria, and this led to a resurgence of Babylon and the Neo-Babylonian Empire. During this time, Babylon was once again the seat of the empire for the first time since the death of Hammurabi in the mid-18th century BC. Now, in the first millennium BC, we begin to see massive changes in Mesopotamia. Under Cyrus the Great, the Persians emerged out of the Iranian plateau and swept right through Mesopotamia like a tidal wave. Egypt by now was greatly weakened and also fell to the Persians in short order. So from this point on, we see both Egypt and Mesopotamia falling to essentially the same empires. Alexander eventually conquered the Persians and took over as ruler of Mesopotamia. The Egyptians didn't even bother to fight Alexander and made him a pharaoh. In the following centuries, the Parthians and Romans fought each other for control of Mesopotamia. Eventually, the Romans turned Mesopotamia into one of their provinces. In the next video, we will discuss the geography of Mesopotamia. And it is geography which is so important to understanding ancient Mesopotamia.